2 cards in 2 minutes. Possible? Yes, yes, yes. Let's start with some stamping. A Misty is a wonderful tool, and this 2-for-1 uses it in a slightly unusual way. Let me show you. This big snowflake stamp is from Captain Pooler Designs, and frankly, if you stamp that on a card, you'll be done. You wouldn't even need a sentiment because everyone knows that a snowflake card is a Christmas card. But let's take it up a notch without adding a lot of time. I started by positioning the snowflake in the center of my card, but toward the top so I'll have space to put a sentiment underneath. If you don't have a snowflake, other simple Christmas shapes will do. A Christmas tree or a stocking, or even a big star. Once the stamp was in place, I turned the Misty to a more comfortable position and I inked it up with Tranquil ink, which is a really pale frosty blue. I stamped it down a couple of times to be sure I got full coverage, and then without removing that big snowflake stamp, I moved the card over to the other corner of the Misty. Then I lined up one of the smaller snowflakes over top and the sentiment below. These cards are one-layer cards, and that's one way to keep your card making fast, just to limit the layers. Once I had those 2 stamps lined up, I put a second card into the left corner of the Misty, and I inked up all 3 stamps. For the smaller snowflake in the sentiment, I used Cove Blue. These 2 stamps are far enough apart you could even use different colors on each one if you wanted. And then I used Tranquil on the bigger snowflake. Now the beauty of this method is that you don't have to stop at 2 cards. You could do many multiples like this. And when you come to the end, you stamp just the darker color on the last card and you're done. And you could stop right here, but if you're comfortable with your ink blending skills, why not add a bit of a frame with a circle stencil like this, and some more of that Tranquil ink? Just a light hand around the edges will ground the snowflake a little and add the appearance of some dimension. If you don't have a circle stencil, you can always create one, but that may add some more time to this project. You could add a bit of ink blending around the edges of the card or coming out from the center of the snowflake for a different look that would still be pretty quick. Now, if you have more time, there are ways to step up today's cards, and my first one would always be to add my iridescent shimmer spray and some gold watercolor splatter. And it's not that this takes a lot of time to do, but you do have to factor in the drying time if you do it. Embellishments like gems and pearls can also be very quick if you've got ones with sticky backs, but if you don't, remember that the glue needs time to dry. You can easily put more than one color of ink onto the big snowflake and use black for the smaller one and the sentiment. Or, as mentioned earlier, you could use 3 different colors for the 3 different stamps. Something quick that doesn't require drying time could be a doodled or stamped frame to add some more definition, especially if you're not doing the ink blending. You could use a metallic marker for the frame or to add some faux embellishments for sparkle. These stamps have matching dies, and instead of one-layer cards, you could stamp them separately and pop them up after die cutting them. Another step-up idea would be to stamp the snowflake once with the blue, then again with embossing ink, and use some sparkly embossing powder for a bit of a wow factor. For my next 2-for-1, you need a piece of colorful paper. I'm using a background I made on my gel plate, but patterned paper or even solid colored cardstock will work here. In fact, now that I think about it, you could do it white on white if you wanted. And again, you need a simple Christmas shape. This time I have this adorable wonky little tree from a Tim Holtz die set, along with its matching wonky star. I cut those from my panel of cardstock along with a circle right around the tree, and now I have the makings of 2 cards. First, you know me, and it won't surprise you at all that I wanted to put that circle on a square card, but it also would have worked on a regular A2 size card. For the second card, I used the frame and the actual tree that I cut. So this is using both the negative and positive cuts of the tree and the circle to get 2 cards. When gluing these pieces to the card base, I like to make sure that I have glue near the corners of the panel, but also around the circle so that no edges will lift up. For the square card, I cut a slightly larger white circle just to pop up the colorful circle a little bit. In the same amount of time that it took me to cut that circle, I could have cut a different color, or I could have cut a scallop circle, so there's lots of options here to get different looks. And speaking of different looks, if you don't have a tree die, you could use a snowflake. If you're really short of time, you don't need to add sentiments to these, but I have this small Be Merry stamp from Mama Elephant. And of course you can use your Misty, but if you're rushing, you may not feel like you've got time for that. My best advice though is to do a test stamping on a scrap piece of paper, just to get the feel of what you need to do to get a good impression. You definitely don't want to ruin the card at this point. Honestly, it's probably faster just to use your Misty, but this can work if you're careful. For a design like this, if you have more time, you could use an embossing folder on that big panel with the circle cut out from it. You could stamp on the background panel with a big background stamp to add some more interest, or you could heat emboss your sentiment and use foam tape to pop up the colorful bits. For my next 2-for-1, I got started before I realized I hadn't turned on my camera, so I'm already blending ink through this stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. And for the first time ever, I'm trying a paper pouncer. Or is it an ink pouncer? Anyway, it's interesting and quite different from using a brush. I found a pounce and twist motion was best for getting the ink down, and I'm looking forward to working with them a bit more before really deciding what I think. I'm working on a piece of 8.5 by 5-inch hammer mill because I'm going to chop this pile of presents in two to be my 2-for-1. And because the paper is longer than the 6 by 6-inch grip mat on my turntable, I'm using the larger grip mat this time. Now honestly, this is the second time I made this card, and I'll show you why I redid it. The first time I made these cards, I just blended 2 colors of red through, and I got a nice blend. But when I finished the cards, I thought they could have used a little festive boost. And I realized that without adding much more time, I could do a double stencil technique and make my presents look a little fancier. So I laid the festive striped stencil over top of the present stencil, and I had to tape it down since they're both the same size, and that top stencil wouldn't be able to grip the grip mat. Then I carefully pounced the darker red ink through both stencils. Those festive stripes are very delicate, and that makes them a little floppy, so that up and down pouncing motion is actually quite beneficial in this case. When everything was blended, I trimmed the panel down into 2, and because of the position of that top present, I put the full present on the left panel, and then I trimmed the right panel down to a 4-inch square for a square card. So even with the 2-for-1, I'm getting 2 quite different looks. Now here comes a big mistake. I grabbed this big waffle flower joy sentiment, and I was a little overzealous with my inking and my pressing down with the door, and I ended up with 3 very distinct smudges. But at this point, it's going to take too long to go back, so I just kept moving forward. For the second card, I didn't want to take the time to clean my stamp, so I used a piece of acetate over top of the panel to protect it while I positioned it where I wanted it. This time, I was much more delicate, and I managed to stamp the sentiment clearly without any smudging. Once I glued the panels onto card bases, I just grabbed some gold sequins and I glued them over those smudges. There are 3, and they're in a triangle, even though they're not exactly where I would have put them if I had been choosing their position, and I think it looks fine. You can't make this 2-for-1 as 1-layer cards because of the way you have to split the pile of presents, but if you have more time, you could mask the presents and use multiple colors of ink if you wanted, or multiple stencils over top to add different patterns to each present. You could add doodled patterns to the presents, and you could add a mat, either red or black, between the stenciled panel and the card base. My next technique is not really a 2-for-1, but I will show you 2 examples. Again, I'm using a background from my stash. This one was made with Lindy's Magicals, which are watercolored powders. And the trick is to use solid stamps and black ink to make silhouettes. I used some nativity stamps from Catherine Pooler, and I immediately became aware of my next problem, which is that there was a flaw on Joseph. Just a little bit of extra photopolymer there, which doesn't look great. I tried to pull it away, and it feels like I will be able to fix it when I have a bit more time. But for now, I just made sure I got good coverage of the black ink where I could. And then I grabbed a black marker and colored in the area with the problem. No one will ever know. Silhouette scenes like this are dramatic, and they're quick and easy because you don't need to do any coloring. And while they're the focal point, this technique also allows your background to shine, which is something I'm always happy with when I'm using a beautiful piece of paper like this. Just so I had 2 of these cards, I stamped another one with the angel and a sentiment. And then to add some definition to the panels, I carefully pressed each edge into my black ink pad. You want to be very careful not to press so hard that you cut the foam, but I find that this is an easy way to add a little definition without an extra layer. It's also quick and it doesn't require any additional supplies because you have your black ink out already. Now I did take the time to add a little masking and ink blending under the nativity scene since it was really bothering me that they were kind of floating. But it's not necessary if you're trying to get out the door with your card. I really don't think these cards need much more than they have, but of course I would add my spritz and splatter and maybe some gems if I had a couple more minutes. I also think they would look dramatic on black mats or card bases, but for me, that would add some time, since I keep pre-cut, pre-scored white card bases on hand, but not any other color. Are these techniques maybe too quick and simple for your Christmas cards? They do work really well for basic cards, but they're maybe even more appropriate for tags, where we're often more likely to want something with minimal layers and work, since they often get thrown out with the gift wrap. I've updated my Tips for Quick Cards PDF to include these 2-for-1 ideas, and you can grab it by using the link in the description below. Just like last week's cards, these cards have no embellishments, and in the next couple of weeks, I'll be back with the ultimate guide for embellishing cards, including talking about types of embellishments, when to use them, and how to know where to place them, even when you don't have any smudges to guide you. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.